A signal from a place that shouldn't exist. A coastal inspection crew near Bar Harbor, Maine, receives an unexpected SOS transmission from the long-abandoned Shatterlight Lighthouse, a structure decommissioned and sealed off over a decade ago following an unsolved disappearance. Initially, they suspect an old radio tower gone haywire, but upon arrival, they discover a journal buried in the dust. What's chilling? The entries are written in their own handwriting from the future. Each page is a warning, a premonition, a terrifying blueprint of events set to begin today. Warning, this is a horror story inspired by true creepy stories, chilling tales, shared by park rangers, Reddit horror threads, and wilderness rescue teams. If you've ever been captivated by creepy outdoor stories or mysterious lighthouse legends, then brace yourself. What follows may forever change how you see beacons in the dark. The ocean breeze was unusually warm for coastal Maine. Officer Blake Carson, a former Navy radio technician turned National Park Ranger, stood on the edge of the weather-worn cliff, his boots crunching gravel as the rest of the search crew behind him stared up at the decrepit shell of Shatterlight Lighthouse. "It's just rocks and bones," murmured Bethany, a trainee with wide eyes that had only read about places like this in scary woods stories. She didn't know yet that the most terrifying true horror stories often don't begin with blood, but with silence. The radio signal had come precisely at 2:13 a.m. It was steady, continuous, and carried with it a pattern, not random static, but structured bursts almost like Morse code, or breathing. Inside the structure, the smell of salt and mold clung to everything. The crew, 6 in total, moved cautiously through the cracked stone halls. Moss crept down the walls like veins. Blake took the lead, guiding them toward the upper control chamber. On the main floor, they found the journal. Bound in brittle leather, it lay undisturbed in a corner beside a rusted cot and a shattered lantern. Its pages were warped with moisture, yet the writing was unmistakably legible, eerily precise, with names, dates, and events no one outside the crew should know. Bethany flipped to a page marked 3 days from now. Carson opens the trapdoor under the spiral stairs. The crew hesitates but descend. The wind stops. One by one, their voices are absorbed. Only Bethany remains. Only she screams. She recoiled as if burned. The others gathered around each person, recognizing entries written in their own handwriting, detailing things they hadn't yet done. "Is this a prank?" asked Luis, the team's botanist. His voice cracked. "No," said Blake, pulling out his flashlight. "This is a warning." As a seasoned ranger, Blake had read his fair share of creepy park ranger stories, ghost sightings, unexplainable disappearances, lost hikers vanishing without trace only to reappear years later, unchanged. But nothing, not even those true scary stories whispered around campfires, had prepared him for this. Following the clues in the journal, the crew found a hidden trapdoor beneath the staircase. Rusted and locked, it required force and some elbow grease. But when it finally creaked open, a chilling gust of wind rising from below against gravity blew out every light in the room. They descended. The tunnel was narrow, lined with rotting boards and strange etchings on the walls, crude depictions of eyes, hourglasses, and figures standing in a circle, their heads bent inward. They passed abandoned boots, tattered ropes, and an old badge labeled Ranger Connors, 1961. Connors had been listed in one of the oldest national park stories of Maine as a veteran ranger who disappeared along with 3 other staff during a lighthouse inspection. Their bodies were never found. Bethany whispered, "I read about him on a creepy outdoor stories thread on Reddit. This is real." The air grew colder with each step. Their flashlights flickered even though the batteries were new. When they reached the bottom of the tunnel, the room opened into a stone chamber not carved by tools, but by time and pressure, smooth as bone. In its center was a radio beacon still glowing faintly, and around it were bones. Human bones piled like a nest. A voice echoed from the radio. "Bethany! Blake! Luis? Thank you for returning. Now repeat the cycle." The crew screamed and staggered back, only to see a second journal appear on the beacon identical to the first, but its pages blank. Luis panicked, bolting back up the tunnel, but when he reached the top, the lighthouse was gone. Nothing but flat rock and gray sky. "This isn't Earth," he whispered, "or it's not our time." Meanwhile, back in the chamber, the beacon began to pulse. Each flash revealed faces in the walls, eyes watching, whispering. One by one, the crew's memories began to fragment. Bethany forgot her last name. Blake couldn't remember why he joined the crew. The journal in his hands rewrote itself, with each page containing decisions he hadn't made yet, but was now forced to consider. It was no longer a lighthouse. It was a loop, a recursive trap designed to ensnare those who answer the call. Blake tried to destroy the beacon, slamming it with a rusted pipe, but it only laughed the voice from the radio, morphing into his own. "Ranger Carson, stop hurting yourself." He fell to his knees. This was worse than the stories he read on Let's Not Meet or creepy stories from Reddit. This was true creepy stories come to life, but made of time paradoxes and mirrors of identity. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the chamber, then darkness. Bethany woke up alone in the ranger station, holding a copy of the same journal. First page read, "Return to Shatterlight Lighthouse. Finish what you started." She looked around. Photos on the wall were different. The date on the newspaper read 2034. Blake's picture was on a memorial plaque. Luis was listed as missing. A chill ran through her spine. "This is how it begins," she whispered. Again, the flickering beacon hummed louder. Bethany's ears rang as the stone chamber pulsed with energy that didn't belong to this world or this time. She clutched the journal tightly, its cover now damp with condensation, though no water had touched it. A phrase kept appearing on every page she turned. "The light doesn't guide you home. It remembers where you tried to hide." She looked around. Blake was frozen in front of the beacon, unmoving eyes glazed. His mouth moved slowly, as if speaking backward. "Blake," she whispered. No answer. She moved closer, whispering again. Blake, suddenly his head jerked up, his eyes now entirely black. This wasn't possession. It was something worse, replacement. A shell of a man animated by time itself. "You're a part of the story now," he whispered. "It keeps going unless someone finishes it." Bethany backed away, but something stopped her. Her boots wouldn't lift, stuck as though magnetized to the cold stone. The radio screeched. Her voice came through. "You already know what happens next," Bethany screamed. Her body convulsed, the journal dropped from her hand, and a flash of red filled the room. She blinked once, and suddenly she was outside. Snow, wind, the cliff. But she was alone. The lighthouse still stood, but now it looked new. The walls were intact, the lantern was lit, and a metal plaque outside read, "Shatterlight Station Memorial Site, established 1933, abandoned after 7 tragic ranger deaths in 1961. Her own name was now etched among the dead. She stumbled backwards, unsure if she was awake dreaming or inside someone else's memory. These kinds of things weren't in the park ranger stories she used to read. This wasn't the type of spooky tale she'd heard on Let's Read or Reddit's True Horror Stories. This was personal. Inside her coat pocket, she found another journal, identical, but this one began differently to the next ranger. If you're reading this, you've entered the loop. Every 72 hours, the lighthouse pulls in new responders. The beacon isn't a warning, it's a trap. Bethany had to get out. She ran, stumbling over rocks and seaweed, ignoring the rusted fence signs reading, "Restricted Federal Site." The trail she had come in on was gone. Every time she tried to follow her compass, it spun wildly. And then the fog came. Not just mist, but a solid wall of white. Living fog. Shapes moved in it, not animal, not quite human. Silent silhouettes that stood still until she looked away. She was lost in a maze of time. She collapsed against a pine tree, or what she thought was a tree. The bark felt like leather, warm and pulsing like a throat. She recoiled, but it was too late. The ground beneath her shifted, turning soft like flesh, dragging her down inch by inch. Just before losing consciousness, she saw them, the others. Faces frozen in fear, park rangers, mariners, tourists. One held a modern flashlight. One wore a ranger badge from 1987. One had her face. All of them mouthed the same words, "Don't finish the story." But Bethany did, and the story restarted. Somewhere far away in a national park office near Bar Harbor, Maine, a new recruit was assigned an unscheduled inspection of an old location. "Shatterlight beacon," the supervisor said. "You'll just be checking the site for signs of vandalism. Old radio equipment might still be transmitting." The recruit named Sarah Franklin looked up. "I thought that lighthouse burned down in the 60s. Her boss shrugged. "That's what they say in the stories, but it's still on the map." She left with a nervous smile, flipping through an online thread labeled "Creepy Park Ranger Stories. Anyone else get called to weird lighthouses?" She never returned. Sarah Franklin tightened her ranger jacket as the wind off the coast howled like a banshee. The trail to the lighthouse wasn't even listed in the latest park ranger stories, and for good reason. According to the records, this area was sealed off decades ago, but the creepy park ranger stories that floated around on message boards like Reddit told a different tale of disappearances, ghost signals, and things seen in the fog. She glanced again at the journal left at her station that morning. It wasn't from anyone she knew. The cover was cracked leather, the pages yellowed and stained. On the inside, one phrase was repeated, scrawled in increasingly frantic handwriting: "The light doesn't warn. It remembers. It repeats." She had almost dismissed it as a prank, another example of creepy outdoors stories people like to invent. But then the transmission came through. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the station radio had flared to life with an SOS signal. "Mayday, Shatterlight, trapped. Repeating, please." Her supervisor thought it was interference, but something in Sarah's gut twisted. It felt real. Too real, like those scary woods stories she'd grown up reading under the covers at night. Now she was here, approaching the remnants of the abandoned lighthouse. But it wasn't abandoned. The windows glowed, and the door was ajar. Inside, the structure didn't match the decay outside. The hallways were pristine. Oil lanterns flickered. The smell of salt and something metallic, almost bloody, clung to the air. Sarah stepped carefully, radio in one hand, flashlight in the other. She reached the main chamber and froze. Dozens of journals lay in a pile, each identical, each bearing a name. Most names she didn't recognize, but one made her drop her light. Sarah Franklin. A voice echoed from the spiral staircase above. "You're right on time." She looked up. A figure stood silhouetted in the lantern glow. "Who are you?" she called. The figure didn't move. One of many, one of none. "Doesn't matter, I'm here responding to a signal." "Who sent it?" "You did," it said. Her blood ran cold. "This is a joke," she whispered, backing up, but her boots caught the edge of a broken floorboard. She fell hard. When she looked up, the figure was gone, and the journals were open, every one of them pages turning violently in the windless air. Then from the radio, "Let's not meet again, Sarah." "But we always do." Hours passed, or maybe seconds. Time had no meaning anymore. She wandered the corridors, each door leading to a version of the lighthouse from a different decade. The 1930s, the 1970s. One room had an iPhone playing a true creepy stories podcast titled The Lost Beacon. Another showed an old black and white television looping static between horror stories broadcasts. She realized something terrible. This wasn't just a haunted location. This was a loop of true horror stories being rewritten every night. And she had been written in. She found a mirror. Her reflection blinked, but her face didn't. It smirked, then whispered, "Finish the story or stay in it." Sarah ran, through corridors, through fog, through time. The lighthouse grew larger as she ran from it like some cosmic joke. Outside, the wilderness twisted, trees moved, the cliffs changed shape. This wasn't just a place. This was wilderness that remembers. She fell again, face in the dirt, breath ragged. Somewhere behind her, bells rang, not from a church, but the lighthouse bell tower. Her radio came alive again. "They told us not to go, but we did. And now we're part of the scary true stories people tell to stay awake." Sarah tried to scream, but her mouth was full of sand, black sand, and it was crawling upward. She awoke in a cabin. The beacon glowed outside, but the radio was gone. In its place, a single piece of paper. "This isn't a rescue, it's a recording. They're listening. Don't finish the story." The storm returned that night, but this one didn't bring thunder or lightning. Instead, it brought whispers, countless voices carried on the wind, all calling out names. Some were distorted, others clear. And among them, Sarah heard her own name again and again, layered between the static of the mist. Sarah, Franklin, Sarah, come back, Sarah, don't leave again. And this wasn't a weather pattern. It was a memory echo preserved and broadcast by the beacon. She had read about this phenomenon before in threads buried deep within stories from Reddit and eerie park ranger stories passed around at campfires. Some called it the echo reverb. Others referred to it more ominously, the whispering coil. It was said to exist only in cursed national parks where reality and wilderness dreams intertwined. Sarah wasn't alone anymore. She'd found others, wanderers just like her. A man named Jesse from Oregon, a survivalist who had heard the creepy park ranger stories on a conspiracy podcast and came to investigate. A woman named Laura who claimed she was a writer for true creepy stories, online searching for her lost brother last seen hiking near the cliffs a decade ago. And then there was the boy. They never got his name. He didn't speak, but he followed them barefoot always, humming something that sounded like a broken radio jingle. Each night, the abandoned lighthouse reactivated, and each night, the journals reset. No matter how far they threw them, burned them, drowned them, at 2:17 a.m. the pile returned with one new entry. Always written in their own handwriting, always forecasting events that hadn't happened. Yet, in one, Sarah read that Jesse would be devoured by the walls. She tried to stop it, but on the third night, he screamed while walking down a corridor. She ran to find him. The wallpaper had consumed him. Where he once stood, there was only wallpaper now, with a bulge in the shape of a screaming face. Laura cried, "I'm going to become a story, aren't I?" she said. Sarah didn't answer, because she remembered one of the creepy outdoors stories she'd read years ago, a tale about a woman who entered a lighthouse and was never seen again. Her photo was grainy, her name Laura Denning. The next day they tried to leave the national park, but the cliffs looped. No GPS, no sun, just fog. Sarah threw a rock off the cliff. It landed behind her. The wilderness wasn't real anymore. It was programmed. Inside the lantern room, Sarah found old equipment still glowing. Cameras, audio reels, a single large button marked playback. She pressed it. Voices filled the room. They were true stories, every one of them. Tragedies of hikers, lost rangers, vanished rescue teams swallowed. It was a library of horror stories curated by something that wasn't human. And above the real player carved into the wood, "Let's read." Her spine chilled. That wasn't an instruction. It was a name, the archivist. On the final night, she and Laura sat by the beach. The sea no longer moved. It was frozen like glass, reflecting not the sky, but versions of themselves, aged, mutated, screaming. "I dreamed I was someone else," Laura whispered. I was a Reddit moderator for scary stories. I banned someone. Then I ended up here. Sarah looked at her. Maybe we all broke the fourth wall. The boy began to hum again. At 2:17 a.m., the journal wrote itself. Laura vanishes. The boy speaks. Sarah stays. And the lighthouse breathes. The door slammed shut. Fog poured from the beacon. The reels spun wildly. Sarah ran not from the lighthouse, but into it, down its spiral core. Each step downward blurred her vision. Decades folded. She saw herself as a child, then an old woman, then no one, and at the bottom a room of mirrors. Each mirror showed her final moment, screaming, burning, becoming the light itself. She refused. She broke the mirror, and then silence. She awoke in the ranger cabin, clean, safe, radio silent, no one else around, just the journal on the table. Let's not meet again. The archivist. But she knew the truth. She had become part of the archive, another ghost in the wilderness, another echo in the beacon, another entry in the book of true horror stories. And somewhere on Reddit, a new post had appeared. I was a park ranger. What I saw in Shatterlight wasn't human. Sarah could no longer tell if it was night or day. The fog erased all reference points. The sun, if it still existed, was being filtered through layers of wilderness stories, not written by human hands, but by something older perhaps, the lighthouse itself. Every breath felt like inhaling memory. She had stopped sleeping. Not because she didn't want to, but because sleep no longer brought rest. It only brought creepy outdoor stories replayed in dreams, like reruns of tragedies she had never lived, but somehow remembered. One night, the boy approached her. He finally spoke. Do you know what "let's read" means? Sarah frowned. You mean like the narrator? He shook his head. No, it's the name of the program. What program? He turned his face toward the water. This one. She followed his gaze. The sea was gone. In its place was a vast black screen stretching to the horizon, flickering with glowing red letters. Let's read, won't live, feed true creepy stories archive. She realized now, this wasn't a lighthouse anymore. It was a transmitter, broadcasting everything to someone or something that fed on fear. In the journals, Sarah found new entries that made her blood freeze. Tonight you will meet yourself from the past. She will not recognize you. She will ask why you came here. Do not answer. At 2:17 a.m., she did meet someone, herself, 15 years younger, lost, scared, holding a map to the national park. Sarah remembered this moment. She had once visited this place as a teen, just a summer trip, but she had no recollection of encountering herself. Until now. Was this the true horror story? Not ghosts, not demons, but infinite loops of self trapped in a recursive echo of wilderness and regret. She tried to break the loop, burned the journals, again, tried to destroy the tower's transmission console, but the boy stopped her. They'll just reboot it. Who's they? He pointed up, not to the beacon, to the sky. That night, the tower received a signal. It was Morse code. Sarah couldn't decipher it, but the boy could. It says, new episode requested. Theme Park Ranger Stories. She trembled. They're turning us into stories. He nodded. And you're the narrator this time. Laura returned, but she wasn't Laura. She had the same face, same voice. But her eyes were voids blacker than night, deeper than any scary woods story Sarah had ever imagined. You wrote me, didn't you, the fake? Laura asked. No, you dreamed of me. No, you let me in. And then she screamed. The sound wasn't from her throat. It was a modulated waveform, like a creepy story being played in reverse. The walls of the lighthouse cracked. Out from them came others. Copies, hundreds of Sarah's, Jess's, Laura's, even versions of the boy, all glitching, all echoing lines from stories posted on Reddit. I was a park ranger. I found a cabin that shouldn't exist. Let's not meet, but we did. This happened in a national park. It wasn't human. The forest wanted me to stay. The tower had recorded every true scary story ever told and fed them into itself, and now it was spitting them back out. Sarah ran to the basement of the lighthouse. There she found a switch marked Purge Transmission. The boy grabbed her wrist. If you flip it, we all disappear. Every ranger, every ghost, every memory. She paused. Will it stop the broadcast? He didn't answer, but she flipped it. The light went out. Silence. Darkness. Relief. Then a voice. Welcome back to Let's Read. Tonight's tale, The Woman Who Turned Off the Light. The tower was still transmitting. Sarah screamed, but no one was listening anymore. The audience had moved on to the next tale, and she had become nothing more than a scary horror story for someone else's entertainment. Sarah did not die, but she would come to wish she had. When she flipped the Purge Transmission switch, the light didn't simply go out, it fractured reality itself. The beam didn't vanish, it inverted, folding in like a black hole, devouring the mist, the shoreline, and then silence. The boy disappeared. So did the endless echoes of copied voices, at least for a while. She awoke not inside the lighthouse, but in the wilderness. Endless pine. Trees bent toward her like they were whispering things. Every breath of wind carried the scent of burnt paper and salt water. And then she heard it again, a radio crackle, a voice. Tonight's tale is one of those creepy park ranger stories you wish you never heard. It was her voice. Sarah stumbled through the woods, following the signal. She reached a rusted national park outpost, a ranger station that looked decades abandoned. But the door creaked open like it had been expecting her. Inside a desk, a chair, a microphone. The red on-air light was blinking, and next to it, a script titled True Horror Stories, The Woman Who Walked Out of the Light. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Everything, every moment, every scream, every false memory was written, and she wasn't the author. She was just the voice. A flickering monitor turned on behind her. Comments began scrolling down the screen. This is my favorite of the scary horror stories. It's like one of those Let's Read episodes from Reddit. Wait, this is a real place, right? Someone find the GPS. Reminds me of those true creepy stories from park rangers. She read them all. Each one chipped away at her mind. Her pain was entertainment, her torment just a tale. Then came the message, submit new entry, and a blinking cursor. She understood now. There was no escape, only submission, only more creepy stories, more loops of true horror stories and scary stories, retold, distorted, fed to the hungry audience out there wherever there was. So she spoke. Her voice broadcast out into nothing and everything. Welcome back to Let's Read. Tonight's episode is one I wrote myself. It's called The Broadcast That Never Ends, based on a true scary story, mine. And she hit record. The tower flickered back to life. The cycle began.